I want to look specifically at what happens when the markets that we have looked at so far, demand and supply, what happens when there are certain failures or certain things that break down, and the particular good or service or resource that we're looking at, it cannot be distributed or allocated through what we know with demand and supply. I'll show you what I mean. I'm going to talk specifically about something called externalities. This is not terribly long, so we'll just finish them up. Let me give you the definition. An externality is the cost or benefit that the consumption or production of a good imposes on society that is not through the workings of the price system. And I'm going to explain this. So generally what we call externalities, an externality is the cost or benefit that the consumption or production of a good, could be a service, imposes on society that is not through the workings of the price system. So the market system that we're used to with supply and demand cannot give us a good understanding or allocation method associated with externalities, and I'll explain what we mean. There are two types of externalities that I want to look at. So there are two types. Let's start with the bad news first. There are two types. The first type of externality, start with the bad one, is a negative externality. Let's do the types, and that might provide some clarity as to exactly what we mean by an externality. So the first type is a negative externality. And this is when the consumption or production imposes an extra cost that is not captured by the market. Give me a minute to write that, then I kind of expand on this a little. So the negative externality, that's the first type we're going to start with. This is when the consumption or production imposes an extra cost that is not captured by the market. Give me a minute to write that, then I expand on that a little. So an externality generally, it either imposes a cost or benefit that's not captured to the price system. There are two types. The first type we're starting out with is a negative externality. And this is where the consumption or production of a good imposes an extra cost or an extra burden that's not taken into consideration by whoever is producing or consuming the good. Now think about it this way. You have a particular individual, for example, or a firm engaging in an activity that gives them satisfaction. They're happy about it, whatever it is they're doing, consuming a good or producing a good. However, by engaging in that activity, there's an extra cost or burden that they're imposing on society. And they have not taken that into consideration. So you have an individual or firm engaging in an activity that's giving them satisfaction. However, by them doing that, there's an extra burden that they're pushing onto society that they did not consider. Can you think of examples where that happens?
Gasoline and pollution.
Pollution is a very good example. Let's say you are producing a good or service. And as you produce that good or service, your aim is to maximize profits, let's say. As you produce that good or service, let's say some smoke comes up out of your factory. Now that extra cost or burden or that pollution is something that you will not take into consideration if you're not forced to take it into consideration. What I mean is this. If you're a rational person and you're producing a good to make money, that's your aim, to make profits. Which means that pollution or extra burden, unless you are forced to take it into consideration, if you're a rational person, you're not going to. That's what we mean when we say it's not captured through the price system. We're going to have to find ways to force you to take that pollution into consideration. Can you think of other examples?
Low-cost clothing manufacturers.
Explain that a little bit.
Well, like for example, H&M, that type of clothing, the impact it has on those societies, that it depresses and causes poverty in those societies like Bangladesh and overseas, where they have to keep those costs so low that it affects the labor market there.
Well, I don't want to say the low cost, but maybe because the low cost can be an efficiency gain overall in terms of prices in the market, but maybe the labor conditions associated with that rather than the low cost per se. Yeah? Can you think of any other examples? The individual engages in an activity and they're getting satisfaction from it, but they're putting an extra burden or cost.
Oh, it's kind of similar to like the sriracha company that the roof fix was giving off a smell, so they were forced to do something about it.
So some pollution, whether it be in the form of, even for smell, I agree.
It's like toxic waste.
Toxic waste, all of that is pollution, yeah?
What about like overfishing? It's like by profiting off of, you know, the sales of fish, you're lowering like kind of extinction. Like
So the overfishing, you're kind of describing what's called an open access good. I don't know if that's an externality per se. It's kind of like an in-between of what is a private or public good, yeah?
Packaged food and waste.
Say that again?
Packaged food and waste.
What do you mean by the waste? You mean like pollution again?
Yeah.
Okay.
And what about like over-exhausting the breaks that they need?
So over-exhausting your labor force, not taking into consideration leisure?
No, like, because legally you have to give your hourly workers those 15 minutes or 10-minute breaks.
Okay.
Aren't they sort of forced to do that? If it were up to them, they wouldn't. Because those 10 minutes...
Well, that's a slightly bigger issue overall. So she's talking about the mandated breaks that individuals need to take. I think it's like 50 minutes after 5 hours of work. It's kind of a slightly bigger issue rather than remember, here's what's happening with the externality. The individual or firm undertakes an activity and they themselves get satisfaction from it, but they impose an extra cost or burden to society.
What about construction? When they do construction on the roads and they close off a bunch of lanes? Because that's a cost to society.
Well, I'll say the construction, if it is the case, all of that smoke and dirt might affect the quality of your home. Or let's say, for example, you live on a street and for you, lime green, shocking lime green is a fantastic color. And you decide to paint your whole house, including your driveway, shocking lime green. Well, that might look great for you, but you might decrease the value overall of other homes on the property. Or if it is that you keep your lawn pretty shabby and you don't fix up your home, you don't really care. It's your home and it's your private property, and you're engaging in an activity that's causing a burden. The example I'm also looking for is smoking. Yeah? So when you smoke, you get satisfaction from it, but the second-hand smoke might actually cause an extra burden or cost to an individual. Have you heard that?
Yeah, I was thinking, how about using cheaper like goods or materials for something else? Like
So the cheaper good, or which was kind of the example Jason was giving earlier, I want to caution there a little bit, because using cheaper goods or services, unless we're tying to some bigger social issue like taking advantage of the labor force, but using cheaper goods and services or cheaper materials, which leads to cheaper price, to me, in my mind, that sounds like an efficiency gain. So we have to tie it to something a little bit bigger.
Well, to tie it to something like, I know a lot of beauty products use a lot of chemicals that the FDA doesn't really regulate because like they use like fragrances and stuff that have chemicals that have that could cause like problems in people, like they're not good to be put on your skin. But they
so by using the perfume, what's the extra burden or cost to society?
I've read that they have like carcinogens and stuff. They could cause diseases in people's bodies.
Well, if that's the case, I would agree.
Well, with cosmetics, there's always animal cruelty as well, the animal testing. But I don't know if you would consider.
Yeah, that's a bigger socialist that I don't even want to touch, to be honest.
What about these big bottled water companies like Nestle that pull water out of the ground? It's free for them,
Yes.
but it impacts society because they're drying up wells, they're impacting the supply.
The depletion of natural resources, some people would categorize it as a little bit of pollution. Another example for me, like I live in Long Beach. I don't like the valley. It's too hot and whatever. I just don't like it. Right? But I started having 8 a.m. classes. And that's when I realized, oh crap, this is not a good idea. So before I decided, okay, I'm gonna rent a place closer. And I rented a place very quickly in North Hollywood, and I did not do a lot of research. Now this apartment building, The average age there is probably about 22 years old, 21. And I'm right under the pool with the hot tub. And these people come alive at 1 a.m. But I have an 8 a.m. class and they're out there and they're playing the beer pong and they're woo, and people jumping in the pool and so on and so forth. No, they're enjoying themselves, but all of that noise filtering up is an externality to me because I have to wake up and then I look crazy with my eyes all red and so on. So stuff like that. You undertake a particular activity, but you impose an extra cost or burden that's not captured in the price system. Now here's the thing. Let's try and graph this out.
The price system though, but
because you as an individual, you summarize your particular satisfaction from that particular good with demand. And if it is that we're not capturing, and the production is also captured with supply, this extra cost or burden is not captured unless we force firms or force consumers to capture this. I'll graph it out and I'll show you.
you can just pay them to stop.
What was that?
You can just pay them to stop.
Well, that's actually one of the criteria that people kind of put in place. Where, how do we force individuals? But we'll look at that in a minute. Let's graph this out. Now, let's think about this for a minute. When it comes to the extra cost or burden that's imposed by a negative externality, so that's an extra cost that these particular individuals place on society. When we have cost, that's the extra. Is cost a factor that will affect demand, or is cost a factor that will affect supply? So when we talk about cost, is that a particular variable that affects the supply curve or the demand curve?
Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter.
So once we talk about cost, under what context do we talk about cost affecting? D or S?
D.
S. Supply.
Pretty sure it's both.
Supply.
So when we talk about factors in terms of affecting supply, cost was one of those factors. So this extra cost issue, the point I want you to make is you're going to need to kind of put it with your supply curve, which means the demand, kind of the same demand curve, but we have a different name for it. Think of it as your demand curve, but we just have a different name, the social marginal benefit. On the supply curve, and if you think about it, with a negative externality, when the individual undertakes the activity, all they're thinking about is their private cost. They're not taking into consideration all of that extra burden that they place on society. Smoke your cigarette, it's for you. That's your particular satisfaction. So this, let's call it Q private. You leave the individual alone to determine the quantity of the good to be provided. All they're going to think about are their private costs. Now let me ask you this. Let's take the pollution example. A firm producing a good or service. And they're producing that particular good or service, but they're polluting the environment. Their aim is to maximize profits, which means all they're thinking about are their private costs. I just want to figure out how much it costs me to produce the good or service. But let me ask you, if we were to force this firm to take into consideration what's good for society, force them to take into consideration the extra costs, how would that affect that representative supply curve that I have there?
Decrease private cost?
It would shift it to the left. Yeah, like this. This is what is appropriate for society, the social marginal cost, this quantity. It's called Q social. So if we force the firm to take into consideration what's good for society, that's what we're denoting as social, then the appropriate quantity is Q social. Now this is where I want you to think a little bit. look at Q private and look at Q social. When a market has a negative externality, what is a firm doing if they are left alone?
Well, they're at equilibrium, I guess.
Well, you could consider these both equilibrium. One is just from the private firm's perspective, and one is what's good for society. But when you compare the quantities specifically, Q social and Q private, if left alone, what is the firm doing?
Taking advantage, they're producing more at a better cost than they would have.
They're producing more of the good than what they should be producing. Whenever we have a particular market with a negative externality, we tend to see an overproduction of the good. What's good for society is Q social, but the firm, if left alone, will choose to provide Q private. So markets that have negative externalities, we tend to see an overproduction of the good. Because really, all they should be giving us is Q social. But if left alone, they give us Q private. That's the idea here.
So that was what Volkswagen did, right?
You could think of it that way. Yeah?
Yeah, that's a good.
Is there a specific agency that regulates overproduction?
No, that's a very good question. If it is, we leave the firms alone and they want to give us Q private, how do we get them to give us Q social? It has to be government intervention. Usually that's the case. But how? What do they do? How do you get the firm to go to Q social?
Incentives?
A penalty?
What do you mean by a penalty?
Like fines.
Who's saying it back there?
I said incentives.
Tax them.
Oh.
Yeah? So, okay, you're going to pollute. Well, you pollute. I'm going to tax you. What else could you do?
Sanctions, fine.
You could put legislation in place. So like the Clean Air Act, for example. So you could just legislate or put some particular policy in place associated with regulating the market. The point is, when you have firms or you have markets with negative externalities, firms left alone will tend to overproduce the good. Usually it's the government who has to intervene and force the firm to go to Q social. So some of the examples are taxes, legislation, and earlier you said you could just pay them. That's actually a particular theorem called Post theorem, where you could leave private citizens to negotiate and bargain and figure it out. That's me going downstairs. I'm paying them $100 to say go to bed. That wouldn't work, by the way. They were having way too much fun. But there are people who argue that we don't need the government to intervene. I kind of don't believe that to my core, of course, where they can bargain and figure it out. But if not having firms bargain and figure it out, then the government can intervene and force them to give us a social quantity.
Wouldn't the firm also run a risk by overproducing?
How so?
Like if they keep on overproducing, let's say the income drops and the demand drops and they have an increase of a surplus of supply.
Well, you're adding a lot of stuff that's happening in the market overall. Really, we're just looking at a very static view, which is here. What's good for society versus what a firm would do if left alone. And once we look at that, the final conclusion is goods that have, or markets, that have a negative externality, firms tend to over-allocate resources and produce too much of the good. And we kind of sort of have to find ways, and when I say we, I mean the government usually, to get them to go to the social quantity.
So is Q private market equilibrium, and then at Q social there would be a shortage?
Not really. Though they're both equilibriums, but it's a matter of from whose view. Right? So with the private, that's the firm just taking into consideration all of their cost of production and not the extra burden they're putting on society. With the social, they have internalized the extra burden. Okay? Here's the other type of externality that can exist. Here's the other one. Negative. And then you have positive. So there are two types of externalities. You have negative and then you have positive. And this is when the consumption or production imposes an extra benefit. And notice the difference here. That is not captured by the market. So Positive externality, the consumption or production imposes an extra benefit that is not captured by the market. So with this one, the firm or the consumer is engaging in an activity. They themselves get a particular benefit from it, but by engaging in the activity, they have an extra spillover benefit to society that they have not considered. Can you think of examples? So you engage in the activity for you, for your own benefit, but by doing that, you have an extra benefit or spillover to society.
When I'm done playing beer pong and I recycle my beer cans.
I'll take
buy
it.
more beer next week.
I'll take that one. Yes?
When you plant trees to manufacture paper.
I'll go ahead with that.
When you make and sell electric cars.
Say that again?
When you sell electric cars.
I'll take that one too. Anything else?
What if you adopt a vegetarian diet?
What if you, come on.
I'll put it there for now. We're not going to get into the conflicts of so on. I'll take it. Yes?
Oh, beekeepers? Beekeepers?
Yeah, that's I saw a beekeeper, and the example here is you'll have the bee, and then I know science very well, so I'm gonna batch this up. They put the pollen in their little legs, and it drops over to orange orchid, so on. Yeah, I'll take it. What is it called? Pollination?
Yeah.
Not very good at science, but absolutely. Beekeeper right beside an orange orchid, for example. I would agree. Or that's a positive externality. What about if you get a vaccine or a flu shot? Yeah? So you're getting a vaccine for tuberculosis for you. You're not getting a vaccine for tuberculosis because you're worried about everybody else. But by getting that particular vaccine, you're not contagious, you don't get the disease, so you indirectly protect society or have a spillover benefit.
What about when you adopt a cat from the...
Alright, we're going to take all of those. I argue that education has a spillover benefit to society. You become more educated, you're less likely to commit crime, you're less of a burden to society, so on and so forth. So I argue that education has a positive spillover effect. You're getting educated, you're here 9 o'clock at night for you, not because you're worried about society. But by doing that, you engage in an activity that has a positive spillover effect for the entire nation. Okay? Now graphically, here's how we depict this. So this one is for positive. So this one is for positive externality. Now, you engage in an activity that gives an extra benefit overall to society. Now, extra benefit, spillover benefit, is that something that's going to affect production, which is a supply, or is that something that will affect demand? Demand. Which means the supply curve is really just the social marginal cost. That already takes into consideration all the necessary elements you need for private and external costs. However, when you get the vaccine, you do it for yourself. You do it as a private benefit. So you're doing that for you. You're not taking into consideration the spillover effects. When you undertake a vegetarian diet, you do that for you. You're not taking into consideration the spillover benefits. So everything is the private benefit. Now, if you were to internalize that extra benefit, then this is what would happen. And here is what is appropriate for society. Now compare the Q private and the Q social. What can we say about markets, or goods or services that have a positive externality? Compare the quantities, Q social and Q private. We tend to have an underproduction or underconsumption of those particular goods. That's why we have empty seats in the class. Yeah? So goods that have positive externality, we tend to have and under consumption, good. Yeah? Under allocation of resources associated with markets with positive externalities, unlike with the negative externality.